Greetings, friends. Operational situation at the front on the 19th of February. Today we will talk in more detail about the Bakhmut, Avdeevsky and Orekhovsky directions, as well as very interesting news from Germany. Well, we'll start briefly with the Lyman direction. It means that active hostilities continue, high intensity remains in the direction of Turnev and Yampolovka. From night to morning, we managed to repel all the attacks, but do not forget what we talked about before, that the enemy's concentration here is still quite high. Potentially, now a lot of people are talking about where Russian troops can go from Avdeevka, whether they can be transferred, because there was information that they were transferred from Podkremennaya to Avdeevka, from near Bakhmut. In general, the troops rotated, supplemented somewhere, sent stormtroopers somewhere. Can they return it? Can they send it additionally? Potentially, this direction is Lymansko, at least Novosadovoy, Terny Yampolovka-Torskaya, but for the enemy, it remains quite, I would say, close to the nearest offensives. That is most likely they can, because a lot of people are now interested in the issue of the estuary, especially local residents. But no one can say anything for sure here, because they can go further beyond Avdeevka. They can carry out assault operations after stabilization measures on Bakhmutskaya. There are a lot of options now, but we will definitely observe Darny and Yampolovka in the near future. In Bologorovka and the Seversk direction, as a whole without any changes, assault operations are continuing in the Bakhmut direction, which means east, northeast and north of Ivanovo. Here, the enemy is pressing quite seriously between the Ivanovo and Popovsky forests, because footage of the use of CBT systems has been published, so the enemy is pulling them up. They do not have such a long range, despite the fact that there is quite effective aerial reconnaissance in the Bakhmut direction, especially from the 93rd Brigade. The aerobombers work very effectively, and let's say, pulling up such equipment, it is naturally fraught with the fact that it is destroyed very quickly, because of its relatively modest range. But as we can see, we observed such moments in a number of areas when Russian troops carried out offensive actions, when, let's say, their task was to break through at any cost, so to speak. Therefore, no one from their side will pay attention to the loss of equipment here, but for them potentially Ivanovskaya remains the main goal for the near future. Therefore, we see very serious activity to the north, between Popovsky Forest and Ivanovo, and the assault operations continue in the area of farm fields, which means the trap of the Stavkov Cascade, along the Stavkov Cascade itself, as well as along the section of the T-050 road in the direction of Ivanovsko. In this area, if we are talking about the eastern positions, they attack mainly with small infantry groups, but from the north, they pull up armored vehicles as much as possible. Now they manage to do it in the cemetery area. The main point. The AFU also published footage of the defeat, fire damage of Russian equipment. But, the opponent pulls her up very, very much. And in order to carry out more serious, more large-scale assault actions, it is exactly the same Popovsky Forest. And we have approximately in this area, the height begins, the ridge on which the city of Yar itself is located. It adjoins the western edge of the Popovsky Forest, so for the enemy, it is an extremely important point on the map, which he would like to get in the near future. We turn to the Avdeevka direction. This means that the enemy's stabilization measures are also briefly taking place along it. We talked yesterday about the fact that, well, they will need at least 2 or 3 days to prepare for the next offensive actions. Today, the enemy reported that they had completely occupied the entire territory of Avdeevka as Sohim. That is, the sweep was completed. Naturally, there remains mining, a lot of surprises left by the APU, but it will still take them a few days, after which they can just increase the pressure on Typovoy and Lastokin. According to the Swallow, what I said on the evening broadcast was that there was no new information about fighting on the outskirts, and very contradictory. So everything is as we said yesterday, the Russian troops did not enter the Lastokin area. So, this was confirmed by a number of Russian military officers, that there was no call, but the fighting on the eastern outskirts. As reported by the same Russian Vomko and Bar, they exist today, and they were yesterday. There were attempts to advance one of the large assault groups, and small groups attacked the eastern outskirts of Lastocken, but they managed to repel all the attacks, so we do not record any changes in Lastocken. At the same time, we make a remark that, in any case, they will try to carry out quite serious, as I see it, assault actions in the direction of the village within, I would say, 1 week. That is, when they carry out relatively stabilization measures in the region, where they will be able to rotate, provide some supplies, and so on, and so on. They will definitely try to advance along the forest belts in this sector of the front, as well as attempts to advance along the Bad Beam, but not so much even in the direction of Lastoshka, as between Lastocken and Severny, in order to bypass Lastocken for a flank attack, and not to carry out assault actions head-on. But this is my vision, based on the activity that they also have, so it means that it is west of the Chemist microdistrict, approximately in this area. Therefore, we do not record any changes in the Avdeevka direction. At the same time, the intensity of the fighting remains high, Pervomeyskaya, Nevelskaya, and there is also a beam between them, along which Russian troops are also conducting attacks in the western direction. So this site is also important for them. We have already said that they will make attempts to level the front line. Why is he potentially important to them? Someone says that they will try to go further for Krasnogorovka. It is unlikely. For them, the main goal is to align the front line along natural borders, and free up some of their troops for offensive operations in other directions. So, here we see just the same natural boundaries, certain cascades of the Stavkov Reservoir, and so on, which will serve as one or another barrier from strikes and counterattacks. Therefore, they are aimed at capturing Pervomeyskaya, Nevelskaya Pervomeyskaya, well, and not taking Tylovo, after which they build their own defense on this site. Because to storm head-on, then go Karlovka after Karlovka, and let's say, for operational space. A lot of people say that they can also go a very difficult area. I repeat, as I like to say on previous broadcasts, a fairly serious defensive line was built during the period of Petro Poroshenko. I do not know how it has been maintained since that period, because it has been years. This is also an urgent question, because if she was supported, she will play her key role. It is located in very advantageous places, these fortified areas, where potentially, the enemy has a minimum number of places where he can advance. These are just the same bridges, crossings, and so on. That is, just the same, let's say, by Pyotr Alexeyevich. At that time, a very competent line was built under Peter Alexeyevich. But again, as far as she is now in the state she was in, this is of course also a question. We go further. So, we do not fix the Mayday-Nevelsky change, we will consider them together with Novomikhailovka. According to St. George's victory, there is pressure from the enemy, and now we can say that the enemy is increasing pressure on this direction. Just the same pressure is not only on Georgievka itself, victory, and the same Novomikhailovka. Pressure is also carried out between settlements, that is, in the area of fields. It is also distracting blows. Attacks are coming from several directions for the same victory. These are all attacks by small infantry groups. Well, of course, the main task of the enemy is to disperse the forces of the Apu and find a gap in the defense. At the same time, why do I say they are increasing pressure? Because there is a report that both the number of air bombs, the number of air bomb strikes, and the number of artillery strikes, it has been gradually increasing over the past 24 hours. In other words, the enemy, just what we talked about, he will use it, from the Avdeevka direction, on neighboring ones. And in this case, it is Kurakovskaya, the South Donetsk sector of the front. Let's just say about him. Yuzhno-Donetsk is here, and intensifies the pressure. In Novomikhailovka, active fighting continues along Academician Timiryazov Street, with varying success. Battles are also taking place on the neighboring street. I repeat, so far there is no confident control on the part of the Russian side, on the part of the Russian troops of this street. Part of this street manages to counterattack, but the situation remains quite difficult. To put it briefly, because the main goal, of course, as we said, is to pull up troops from the south. The APU does not allow such a scenario to develop now, but again, the enemy, as you can see, does not slow down, it presses. And its main goal is precisely to attrition, simultaneously attacking in neighboring areas both north of Novomikhailivka and south of a number of areas where attacks from the enemy take place. Therefore, the fighting continues. And we move on to the Zaporozhye section of the front, the Orkhov direction. So a few moments. We'll start with recruitment. Fighting continues. Now the main bet of the enemy of the Russian troops is to align along the Surovikin line. It means that the ledge, which was formed small, to advance from those positions that they managed, from south to north, respectively from west to northeast, and accordingly, west of the Verbovo itself. Activity is already being observed by Russian troops within the gray zone. We will talk now, but in the near future. The enemy's assault actions are part of the Surovikin line. This is based on the vector of their latest attacks. At the same time, there is also activity on the part of the Russian troops between Novoprokopovka and Verbov, that is, not only where we noted the advance yesterday, but also within the neighboring forest belts between these settlements, are also being pressed. The main goal now is to align the front line, and, accordingly, to try to get close to Rabotino from several directions, including from the eastern flank, not only from the west. Well, we turn to the work itself. There are a lot of messages going on, and some of them, unfortunately, are reliable about the assault actions of the settlement itself. But let's take it in order. So yesterday we talked about the vector of attacks by Russian troops, so detailed information has already appeared, how he carried them out from south to north, then from west to east, and so there were several attacks from his side. Some of the attacks were distracting. For example, the one that was from the settlement of Kupani. Those attacks that were northwest of the fortified area, it was more distracting, because the main goal was to break through approximately in this area, which means to land. And another blow was flanking to enter the western part. And now let's make changes. So, the situation for yesterday, the situation for today looks like this. On the southern outskirts of the city, there will be heavy fighting, including the battles for the fortified area. There are a lot of reports that Russian troops were able to gain a foothold in the settlement from the south. Not in the south, there are active hostilities on the outskirts of about this area. But as for the west, there really Russian troops managed to advance further after an attack in one of the forest belts and enter the settlement itself. Footage of artillery strikes on the position of Russian troops on the western outskirts was published, so a gray zone was added. The situation remains to be clarified, because information is coming that somewhere it was possible to push the Russian troops, but somewhere they maintain their presence. The forest belt means it is a trap from work, but it is under refinement. And I will probably tell you in general, this whole area is currently being clarified, because the high pace of hostilities continues, and the fighting continues right now in the morning. The enemy presses, and accordingly tries to pull up fresh forces. Now, in order to increase pressure on the settlement itself, not only from the south, but also from the west. At the same time, do not forget that one of the enemy's goals, one of his tactics that he uses on the battlefield, is the dispersion of APU strikes. Therefore, there are strikes from the company's settlement, in the east-northeast direction. The neighboring plots, they are also very, very active now. That is in fact, the same as in the area of Thorns. Tor means the turns of Yampolovka, too, which was in the Avdeevka direction, the same as in the Novomikhailivka area and the Bakhmut direction, that is, the APU is trying to distort the forces of the APU as much as possible, to neighboring areas. This is the situation we have at the front. In any case, it is necessary to state one more point on this section of the front, Zaporozhye, that the enemy did not use the forces that were mentioned before. There is a group there. Its number is about 50,000, such and such a number of armored vehicles. At the first blow, really massive, there were 30 units involved. So then there were an additional 4 units put into battle, but in total 34 for work on, and 2 more. 36 in the direction, well, and 34 self-boots. These are not the figures that were announced, hundreds of armored vehicles. Here, the enemy saw again the effectiveness of aerial reconnaissance. We have said that the weather is now good enough for the effective work of aerial reconnaissance, so the revision of tactics is being carried out. But in any case, they are pulling up additional forces in order to continue the assault operations. Therefore, we continue active military operations in general on the so-called Rabotino salient. And now, I will comment on some interesting news.